Good day everyone, I am Lord Celine and I'm going to discuss the revenue contracts part of the topic and its recognition and measurement. IFRS 15 revenue from contracts with customers applies to all contracts with customers except for. So una, alamin muna natin kung ano ulit ang IFRS 15. Ang IFRS 15 ay promulgated ng International Accounting Standard Board para mag-provide ng guidance sa pag-a-account ng revenue from contracts with the customers. So ito ay applicable lamang sa consumers at meron ding exception. Ito ay yung una, leases within the scope of IAS 17 leases. Meron itong dalawang uri. Yun ay ang finance lease, kung saan ang lease natin ay nagtatransfer substantially lahat ng risks and rewards incidental to ownership. And yung isa naman ay ang operating lease, kung saan dito sa lease na ito ay kabaliktaran ng finance dahil ito ay hindi nagtatransfer substantially lahat ng risks and rewards incidental to the ownership. Then, ang pangalawa naman ay kapag pasok sa financial instrument and other contractual rights or obligation na belong sa IFRS 9, 10, 11, IAS 27, and 28 investment in associate and joint ventures. Third ay ang insurance contracts with the scope of IFRS for insurance contract. Lahat naman dito ng insurance contract, including reinsurance contract that an entity issues at reinsurance contracts that it holds, except for specified contracts covered by other standard. Kasi, syempre, hindi naman nila fully covered yung ibang contracts dahil nasa ibang standard, kaya may except na yun sa reinsurance. So, last is the non-monetary exchange between entities in the same line of business to facilitate sales to customers or potential customers. Dito naman ay hindi pwede gumamit ng tinatawag na barter among entities para lang maabot yung demand ng isang company dahil hindi nga pwedeng i-apply ang IFRS sa mga collaborating partners. Dapat ay sa consumer lang. Halimbawa na dito ay minsan yung dalawang company ay nagtitrade ng oil out of commodities or swap them in order to meet a certain demand. Ibig sabihin, hindi may a-apply doon ang revenue contracts kasi hindi naman sila customers, kundi collaborating parties lamang. So, a contract with the customer may be partially within the scope of IFRS 15 and partially within the scope of another standard. So, di ba nga, ang nabanggit ko sa last slide na patatlong exception, may ibang contracts na covered din ng ibang standards. Kaya pwedeng partially belong ang isang contract sa IFRS 15 o kaya naman ay sa another standard. So, in that scenario, meron tayong dalawang pagbabasihan. First is, if the other standards specify how to separate or initially measure one or more parts of the contract, then those separation and measurement requirements are applied first. So, the transaction price is then reduced by the amounts that are initially measured under the other standards. So, pag may binigay na guide ang standard kung paano hahatiin ang parts ng contracts, ay ito munang i-apply. Hindi siya pwedeng i-apply agad sa IFRS 15 dahil naka-specify na sa mismong standard iyon ng contract. Then after na matapos ang measurement requirements from other standards, ay pwede nang i-apply ang IFRS 15. Then the second one is if no other standard provide guidance on how to separate and or initially measure one or more parts of the contract, then IFRS 15 will be applied. So kapag wala namang standard guidelines na sinabi kung paano isa-separate yung parts ng contracts, ibig sabihin ay magpo-focus na lang ang accounting or finance team sa pag-apply ng IFRS 15 sa pag-a-account. So in this slide at sa susunod na makikita natin ay yung some terms na pasok sa recognition and measurement revenue. So first is the contract, an agreement between two or more parties that creates enforceable rights and obligation. So, ito nga yung mga usapan or kasunduan ng different parties na nagbibigay ng obligation at ito ay legally enforceable kapag binrake. So, pangalawa ay ang customer. It is a party that has contracted with an entity to obtain goods or services that are an output of the entity's ordinary activities and exchange for consideration. So, sila yung nagko-consume ng mga products from the company. Kaya sa kanila nakita ng revenue ang mga entity. Then, the income, which is the increases in economical benefits during the accounting period in the form of inflows or enhancement of assets or decreases of liabilities that result in increase in equity, other than those relating contributions from equity participants. So, ito ay yung kita ng company or mga pumapasok na pera or total earnings mula sa accounting period. Kaya napapataas nito yung equity ng isang company kapag nag-increase ang assets at nag-decrease ang liabilities. The next one is the performance obligation, a promise in a contract with the customer to transfer to the customer either a good or service or a bundle of goods or services that is distinct. So, dahil nga mayroong promise contract, tinatawag itong performance obligation kung saan required ang entity na mag-transfer ng distinct asset sa kanilang customers. Then, the revenue, which is the income arising in the course of an entity's ordinary activities. So it is generated by the sales of goods and services in the primary operations ng mga business. Then, the transaction price naman is the amount of consideration to which an entity expect to be entitled in exchange for transferring promised goods or services to a customer, excluding amounts collected on behalf of third parties. So, ito naman yung pinaka-price ng goods or services na ino-offer ng company sa kanilang customers. Pero, exception na dito yung ibang amount tulad ng mga VAT. Let us proceed with the recognition and measurement of revenue. So, generally, revenue is recognized when entity has transferred promised goods or service to the customers. So, alam naman natin na after ng certain transactions, ay agad natin mare-recognize ang revenue. Pero, may guidelines din na ibinigay ang PFRS 15 para makatulong sa mga entity with their recognition. At we will tackle it in the next slide. PFRS 15 sets out 5 steps for the recognition process. One is identify the contracts with the customers. 2. Identify the separate performance obligation. 3. Determine the transaction price. 4. Allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation. And 5. Recognize revenue when as performance is satisfied. So, each of these 5 steps has its own considerations and complications. Kaya IFRS deeply analyze before recognizing. At ang mga step na to ay kung inyong natatandaan pa ay na-discuss na din sa Module 3 ng Group 1. Kaya alam ko may idea na kayo about dito at i-discuss ko na lang ulit briefly para hindi nyo malimutan. So, step 1, identify the contracts with the customer. So, contract criteria. A criteria in which the contract must meet bago mag-exist for purposes of revenue recognition. 1 approval of contract in writing, orally, or in accordance with customary business practice. And 2 identification of rights and obligation of the parties and payment terms. And 3 is the contract has commercial substance and collection of consideration is probable. So, nakasanayan na nga ng mga business industry na pag contracts ay maaaring written or orally. Kaya bago magkaroon ng isang contracts, dito papasok yung approval ng both parties bago magkaroon din ng obligation. So, dapat din ay specified ang rights and obligation ng parties and it should have a commercial substance kung saan they are looking for the possible risks or cash flows in the future na magiging epekto ng contracts. So, contract criteria, exception to separate contracts. This is the case where contracts should be combined as one if the requirements below are satisfied. Yung mga requirements ay 1. If the contracts are treated as a single package. 2. Consideration in one contracts depends upon the goods or services of another contracts. At 3. Goods or services in the contracts relate to a single performance obligation. So, ang mga requirements ng isang contracts para makonsider siya na recognition approach ng step 1 ng IFRS ay ang mga yan. Next is step 2. Identify the performance obligation in the contract. So, the distinct good or services criteria. Ang una ay the customer can benefit from the good or service. Ang 2 ay the entities promise to transfer the goods or service to the customers is separately identifiable from other promises of the in the contracts. So, a performance obligation ay magiging distinct and promise good if mamimit nito ang mga criteria ng goods or services na tulad ng kung ito ba ay beneficial at kung ito ba ay identifiable at madaling ma-distinguish ayon sa ipinangako ng isang party to another. Then, distinct good or services. Ito yung mga characteristic na tinatawag nating distinct goods or services. Itong 5 below. Ayun ay yung sale of finished goods produced by a manufacturer, sale of merchandise inventory by a retailer, constructing, manufacturing, or developing assets on behalf of customers as in long-term construction contracts. 4 ay granting license or franchise. At ang 5 ay performing a contractually agreed upon task for a customer as in bookkeeping service or payroll processing service. So, ang mga nasa taas na yan ay mga distinct na goods or service na pwedeng ma-transfer sa isang entity sa kanilang consumer if meron silang performance obligation. So, proceed naman tayo sa step 3. Step 3 ay determine the transaction price. So, there is a factors that affect the transaction price in order to identify the transaction price, we need to consider the following factors such as variable consideration, time value of money, non-cash consideration, and consideration payable to a customers. So, in this step, sa step 3, we can easily distinguish that taking into consideration all of the prices for a certain good is really important to compute and determine the exact amount of transaction price of the product or services without including any of the third parties amount from the goods. So, malaki talaga ang may tutulong kung lagi nating iti-take into consideration yung mga ibang amounts na pero hindi natin papakialaman yung from behalf of other parties dahil magpo-focus lang tayo sa mismong transaction price. Then, ang step 4 ay allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation in the contract. So, ang transaction price is allocated to each performance obligation on the basis of relative standalone selling price or yung presyo kung magkano ibebenta ng entity ang good or service separately sa kanilang buyers. So, then if not directly observable, it must be estimated using this method such as adjusted market assessment approach kung saan nagre-refer ang market sa presyo ng kanilang competitor sa certain or similar product or services. So, 2 is expected cost plus margin approach, wherein company forecast their expected cost para maabot ang kanilang performance obligation na in-adjust for appropriate margin. And last is residual approach, kung saan applicable lang ito if uncertain yung selling price. At under din ito ay malaki ang difference ng standalone selling price sa transaction price ng isang goods or services sa contract. Lastly, the step 5 or recognize revenue when or as the entity satisfies a performance obligation. So this step is the last part kung saan magde-decide na if ma-recognize ba ang revenue after ng whole process of identifying and analyzing kung pasok ba ang mga criteria ng bawat step ng IFRS 15 recognition approach. So dito ma-recognize na after ma-transfer ng goods or services sa customers. So below are the decision requirements of entities in recognizing revenue. First ay, revenue shall be recognized when an entity transfer control of the good or service to a customer. Then second, control of an asset is the ability to direct the use of assets and obtain sustainability of all the benefits from the assets. And lastly, revenue can be recognized either at a point in time or over time. So as we discuss the summary about the 5 steps of IFRS 15 revenue recognition model, this will give us the idea that the different entities requires a lot of analyzation and ensure that they have sufficient understanding about the contractual terms to identify when the revenue should be recognized. So this is just a short discussion and review ng iba sa nireport ng ating Group 1 sa Module 3, which is the recognition and measurement. Sana ay may maalala kayo sa topic na ito. Yan lamang. Thank you.